If you're wondering what a good hourly rate should be for your welding services, watch the last 4 minutes of this video. Today we're going to continue the staircase project that I've been working on. If you haven't seen the first 2 videos of this project, there will be links in the description of those videos if you want to go check those out. So the first thing that I wanted to focus on this particular day was the 2 long legs that I'm going to be putting up underneath the highest part of this staircase. I started out by rounding the edges off of the feet that I'm going to be welding on one end of the legs. When I say feet, I just mean a piece of 3/16 plate, 6 inches by 6 inches, with holes in them so I can bolt the staircase to the concrete. And then on the other end of the legs, which would be the top of the legs, I'm going to be capping the angle cut that I put on here, because I'm actually going to be putting these legs up underneath the top of the staircase. That way the front of the channel, the front of the stairs, is going to butt up to the platform where these stairs are leading to. That way all that's flush. And it's technically stronger, I guess, because they're up underneath the stringers instead of up against. But I wanted to cap this angle part, that way I'd have more surface area to weld the staircase stringer to on top of the leg. To do that, I measured the inside of my tubing, the dimensions of that particular cut, and I made the piece just a little bit smaller than the actual hole. That way I could get good penetration all the way around. And then I took a piece of welding rod and tacked it to the plate, then inset it, made it flush with everything else. I wanted it to look essentially like a solid piece of square tubing with a cut in it. I wanted to keep the roundness of the square tubing, like the rounded edges and stuff, but I wanted it to be clean, so that's why I wanted to sand it down. That way I could have a good fit up against my stair stringer. I used 332/70/18 to weld my feet on, but on this capping process, I used 532/80/10. You can definitely use 1/8/60/10. You could even use 70/18 up here, but this is always my go-to rod on this type of situation. To get the length of my legs, I just subtracted the angle cut of my channel at the top of my stairs, which in my situation was about 12 inches here. And then of course I subtracted the 3/16 plate that I put on the bottom. To find the angle that I needed, if you'll come down here, I'll show you how I did that. So I used one of these guys right here. It's a plastic angle finder is what I call it. But we're gonna pretend this is the platform. We're gonna pretend this is the square tubing. And then this is going to be our 10-inch junior channel that we used for the stair stringers. I essentially robbed the angle off of the stairs that I had already built. And I was only able to do this because the angle of these stairs are gonna be the same as the stairs that we're working on this particular day in this particular video. So I just ran this up here and put it up against my stringer, snug that down. That's how I knew what angle, because if you take this line, since this leg is going to be up underneath my stringer, I know this is going to be my angle. So that's how I found out what angle I needed to cut my square tubing to on these taller legs. After I got my legs ready to go, I hooked onto my staircase and I got it all ready to put up into place. But before I took it up into place, I went ahead and capped the channel down on the ground. This way it lessened the work that I had to do up on a ladder. I used 1.5" 3/16 to cap the channel, sanded it down nice and clean, and then I was ready to lift it up into place. One thing I do want to touch on here is when it comes to doing stuff ahead of time, I'm a firm believer in that, depending on the situation. On a small project like this, whenever I'm the only one that has to communicate with myself, it's less likely to have an error. And in this particular situation where I'm just capping stuff on the ground versus like the legs, for instance, I already cut the legs to length. And so if those measurements are wrong, I'm gonna have to recap the end and everything. So that's kind of a better example as those legs. But I want to touch on this because I've been in situations where I've been working for bigger companies as a welder where like The company might have got some stuff pre-built in a shop somewhere and got it shipped to location for like a station or tank battery or something. And we've had to cut stuff apart because it was wrong or somebody changed their mind. But in my opinion, the problem lies in those issues right there. You know, the communication, the chain of command. If the chain of command's too long and the miscommunication is wrong by the time it gets down to the in the field installment, it could be different, or somebody up higher or the client might have changed their mind or something like that. So it's just something I wanted to mention, that like when it comes to doing stuff ahead of time, like on the ground or in the shop versus on location, I think it's a great idea, and I think it can be safer, faster, and more enjoyable, but it can also bite you in the butt if there was not enough thought and planning and solid decisions made beforehand. Just something to think about. All right, so now this is the exciting part. Once I got my channel capped on the ground, I was able to lift my stairs into place. It took me about 3 different tries to decide how I was gonna do this efficiently or easier or whatever. The first idea was to rig it up level, hanging from my gin pole there. I was gonna rig it up perfectly level and just back into place and then move it up and down. That didn't work very good. I couldn't, or I didn't take the time, or it wasn't going well for me to get that rigged up just right. My next plan was to put jack stands up against the platform, high enough right up against the platform to catch the stair stringers. That didn't work well either. So then the next plan was to tack pieces of angle to the proper height on my platform. And then it hit me that I could just use clamps instead of tacking it. If I could do it over again, I probably wouldn't be opposed to tacking it. You just have to grind a tack. But what I learned whenever I used clamps was that while trying to do this by myself and lifting it up and moving it, if I bumped that angle too much, coming down too hard, it moved my angle. Although it's not a big deal, it still would have been more solid if I was just to put a couple of tacks on there. But either way would work. But I ended up just using clamps and it worked fine. One thing I wanted to point out, if you didn't notice, on this upper set of stairs, I left the point or the whole miter on the channel because I needed that bottom part so I would have something to weld to the platform. Versus the bottom set of stairs, I cut it off. I cut that point off because it was going to be setting on the ground. That's something that I'm glad I thought of before I went to cutting both sets of stairs and accidentally cutting it off, because it was a very vital part of my marrying or putting together of my stairs. So before I tacked my stairs to my platform, I went ahead and checked my platform to make sure it was still level. That's one thing I constantly try to do whenever I'm working on a project like this. Very frequently check to make sure everything is still where it's supposed to be. After that, I was ready to go ahead and tack the stairs to the platform using 70-18. And then I went ahead and tacked one of my legs on. Before I tacked my other long leg on, I had to actually lift my whole project up 2 or 3 inches, because if you haven't seen the previous 2 videos, in the previous 2 videos I talked about how this concrete that I'm working on is falling in 2 directions. So I'm having to build this thing all in jack stands. So to get this last leg on, I had to lift the whole project up a couple of inches so I could actually get that leg on. This proved to be pretty difficult and tedious, I guess you could say, especially working by myself. I was using wedges and all kinds of things to try to keep that leg where I needed it and still be able to tack it off. But we got her. After I got that leg tacked up, I noticed my other leg was a little bit off, so I actually had to cut some tacks on that other leg. While making sure these legs were plumb, I was also still checking the platform and the other set of stairs for level. That's one thing I talked about in the previous videos, and I'll say it again here. When it comes to welding and fabricating, not being afraid to cut a tack. because ultimately I want the end product to be as perfect as can be. A guy once told me years ago, if you shoot for perfect, you'll have way less room for error in the end product. Not only was I using a level to make sure everything was level, I was also getting down eye level with my feet and making sure that all my feet were in the same plane. If you don't know what I mean whenever I say in the same plane, this here is essentially a plane. Like this is all one plane versus like this right here is another plane, or this right here is another plane. This plane's here and this plane's here, different elevations. So like since I'm building this staircase, I got 6 legs and I'm building this staircase on unlevel concrete. So I'm building it in the air to make sure all my feet are the same elevation. I don't want to end up with any of my feet, like pretend these are my legs on my staircase. I don't want to go set it in place and have like 1 foot up off the ground a little bit because I wasn't checking that as I was building it. So hope that makes sense. Pipe Fitter's Blue Book, available in the Aross Welding shop, arosswelding.com. Somebody commented on one of my videos and they said, Austin, if that makes sense, Ross. So now every time I say, if that makes sense, that's what I think about. Thought that was funny. I'm just always hoping that I'm making sense because I want to help. I want to make sure I'm helping you. So the next couple of things I wanted to do before I welded the whole staircase out, and what I mean by welded out is finished welding everything. Whenever I'm building any project, I have a tendency to just tack everything real good. For one, this is the way I was taught by those with more experience than me that I've worked around over the years. And for two, I think the reason I was taught that way and why I still agree with this way of doing stuff, for the most part, with most projects, it allows you to change anything without cutting out a whole tack. It's a lot easier to cut just a tack than it is to cut a whole weld. It's a lot cleaner of a process versus cutting out a whole weld. Way less grind time if you mess something up or if you need to change something. So it's just a good rule of thumb to wait to weld everything out until you got the whole project put together. Like I said, depending on what it is. So anyway, one of the things I had to do was cap the ends of the channel down up against the platform. And then another thing I did was I went ahead and put a couple of braces in between my tall legs and then from my tall leg to my platform, just to kind of tie these tall legs in to the main platform. I put them on this back corner only because where this staircase is going, that is literally going to be in a corner, but I didn't want to put anything in front, like a brace up front, just in case they wanted to use that bottom part for storage for any reason. And since this is getting bolted to the ground, it really didn't need any bracing whatsoever, in my opinion, because with it being bolted to the ground, that is its own support in itself, if that makes sense. If that makes sense. All right, so now it's time to weld everything out. I welded the majority of this staircase out with 332 7018. I did end up putting another tack on each side of each step or each tread with 7018. The only place where I did not use 7018 was on the downhill parts and the overhead parts of the square tubing supports that I just got through talking about, the horizontal pieces I put in. On the top part I used 7018, but on the rest of it I just used 532 8010. You could use 1/8 6010 or 332 6010, anything like that would work. The reason I used 8010 or this type of rod versus 7018 is because with this 2.5 square 11 gauge, for one, 11 gauge is a little bit thin and the square tubing has a rolled edge on it. So where they meet up, there's kind of a little gap there. And 7018 just doesn't always look the best, or that's not my go-to whenever it comes to this particular type of weld. So I just used 6010 because for me, I was able to make it look more presentable with this downhill rod versus the uphill 7018. So I got everything welded out and I still had a couple of hours left in the day, so I wanted to go ahead and get my mind wrapped around this handrail. And I'm glad I did because boy, did it give me some trouble. Angles are not my expertise. So I sat back and I studied put an angle finder on it, studied again, sat back, studied. Not only was I studying what angles everything needed to be, I was also studying how I wanted everything to tie in. So for example, what I mean by at the top of each one of my stringers, I had that little bit of flat spot that I keep talking about. And whenever you're building a handrail, all that comes into effect, you know, like where you're gonna put your brakes at on your top rail, if that makes sense. So that's one of the things I was studying. Long story short, the handrail kicked my butt this first day, let me just say that. So I thought I had the angles good, you know, I cut my uprights, and I went to lay my top rail in on this first section that I was working on, and the angles were wrong. So then I just turned off the camera, if I'm being honest, just turned it off. Click, shut her down. I was upset at myself, I was aggravated, I was embarrassed. Even though it was just a time lapse, I was still like, I'd done all this work, cutting all these parts. Yeah, I cut more than just that section because I thought I had my angle figured out and it was wrong. But anyway, once I got frustrated, I couldn't leave until I figured out what angle I needed so I could come back the next day and feel refreshed and confident about the angles I was gonna use for the rest of it. So this is what I got accomplished by the end of the day. I felt good about it. I'm glad I stayed and figured it all out and got everything going in a good direction before I left. I am glad that I quoted this job for a certain price versus doing it by the hour, because I felt better about the time it took me, the extra time that it took me to get the angles right on the handrail and whatnot. And that's actually one thing I want to touch on, is charging hourly versus quoting a job. A lot of you ask because a lot of you are just now getting into it. And to me, my opinion, it all depends on the situation, the negotiation, the relationship with whoever you're offering work to or whoever's asking you to do work. That matters also. You know, if somebody's asking you or if you're going to them for work, like who's got the cards, you know, that's how you kind of look at it. One of you said on one of my videos, which I thought was awesome, said something along the lines of, charge what you're worth, but also be worth what you're charging. And I really liked that. It really hit the nail on the head for me, but it can be hard to judge what you're worth, especially if you're young or just getting into the trade. I mean, most of it will come out in the wash, because if you're charging too much, but your end product isn't up to par, chances are you may not get a call back type of thing. That's just a basic example. And like vice versa, you can work yourself to death because your rate is so low that you get lots of work, but you find yourself not doing the best financially because you feel like you're working in circles but your bank account isn't growing. So like there's two opposite ends of the spectrum. So that's why businesses are always reevaluating and stuff. So like I think a lot of it will come out in the wash, but that's one thing that I wanted to bring up, and I really liked what you said, whoever it was that said that, because it matters and it's super valuable in this trade. You know, I went to welding school for free my junior senior year of high school because it was offered to us for whatever reason, and I still left school subconsciously thinking that I was worth more than what I was. I didn't know that then. In my eyes, then I went to welding school. I was taught to do MIG, TIG, flux core, stick. I got certified in stick welding. So to me, I was on top of the world. I was a good welder because I passed a test, you know. But my first welding job started out at $9 or $9.50 an hour. And I was tickled pink to have it because I needed a job, but subconsciously I was like, wow, this is not very good money. But looking back, now that I look back on it, super great job, great experience I got there, well worth the money. And I've talked about that in a few of my videos, and I want to pass that along, you know. Those of you that are trying to get into the trade or, you know, wondering how to charge, yada, yada, yada. My advice overall would be start with whatever you can get your hands on. Because if that's a connection you have, then that's all you got. You either make more connections or you utilize what you have and you make the best of it. And as long as you're dedicated to getting better at welding and doing what you want to do, you'll stay places for the experience, not so much the money, because the experience is what's going to allow you to branch off to do your own thing and ultimately make the money that you want to make. But you have to get that experience first. So that's my advice. But we'll talk more about the handrail in next week's video. Thank y'all for coming along with me. I hope y'all are learning from my mistakes, because for some odd reason, I don't mind making mistakes. It bothers me a little, but not enough to not share it. I don't mind sharing it. So if you and I can both learn from my mistakes, all the better. Thank y'all for watching, and remember, learn something every day.